It's strange how something as small as an old camera can feel so heavy, like it's carrying a whole other life inside it. That's exactly how it feels every time I hold it now, the weight of it resting in my hands, like a memory I can't quite shake. I hadn't touched it in years, not since I moved out here to Willow Creek Ranch, not since I left behind the version of me who used to live with that camera always slung over her shoulder. Back then, it wasn't just a hobby or some tool I used. It was part of me, almost like an extra limb. I used to wake up every morning with this excitement buzzing inside me, wondering what light I'd catch that day, what moments I could capture before they disappeared. It made me feel like I had purpose, like I could see things no one else noticed and show them something beautiful. That was who I was. Isla, the photographer, the dreamer who chased the perfect shot no matter how far she had to go. But it's been a long time since I felt like her. Somewhere along the way, I let that part of me slip away. Maybe it was when I met Marcus. He came into my life like this steady, grounded force when everything else felt uncertain. He wasn't like the people I used to know, the artists, the wanderers. Marcus was sure, confident, knew exactly what kind of life he wanted to build. He made me feel safe, like I didn't have to keep running or worrying about what came next. And I wanted that more than I realized. So, I said yes to the life he painted for me. I packed up my things, tucked the camera away in a box, and moved to the ranch with him. At first, it felt like a relief. Willow Creek is beautiful. The rolling hills, the way the sky stretches out endlessly, the quiet that settles over everything at sunset. I thought maybe that would be enough to fill me up. I told myself I didn't need the chaos anymore, didn't need the galleries or the constant chasing. Marcus promised me a future that was solid, something real I could hold on to. And I believed him. I wanted to believe him. But the thing about trading your old life for something stable is, after a while, that stability starts to feel like stillness, and not the peaceful kind. The kind that seeps in and makes you wonder if you've gone completely still yourself. I didn't notice it at first. Days turned into weeks, weeks into years. Taking care of the ranch became routine. Marcus was always busy, focused on keeping everything running, making sure we had what we needed. People around town would smile when they saw me, tell me how lucky I was to have this life. I'd smile back, nod, say the same thing every time. Yes, I'm lucky. But every time I walked past the shelf in the barn where that old camera sat gathering dust, something inside me would twist just a little, like a tiny reminder of something I'd left unfinished. I didn't know how much I missed her, the girl I used to be, until I caught myself standing there one evening, staring at the camera like it might hold all the answers I'd been too scared to ask. The sun was setting outside, casting this soft orange glow over everything, the kind of light that used to make me drop everything and run outside to catch it before it disappeared. And there I was, frozen, not even sure if I had it in me anymore to pick up that camera and look through the lens. It's not that Marcus told me to give it up. He never said I couldn't be that person. But somehow, I convinced myself there wasn't room for both lives. I couldn't be the steady, reliable wife and also the wild, restless artist. So, I chose the version of me that felt easier, the one that made sense to everyone else. Only now, holding the camera again, I realize how much of myself I tucked away when I made that choice. It's like carrying around an empty shell, going through the motions but never quite feeling whole. And the longer I let it sit there, untouched, the more it starts to feel like I've abandoned something important. Not just the camera, but the part of me that believed in chasing beauty, in following my own voice instead of everyone else's expectations. Sometimes I wonder if it's too late, if that girl I used to be is too far gone, If all that's left is this version of me who stands at the barn door, clutching old dreams she doesn't know how to revive. But then, every once in a while, there's a moment, a slant of light, the way the wind moves through the trees, that reminds me she's still there, waiting. Maybe all I have to do is finally pick up the camera again and see what happens. It's funny how life has this way of surprising you right when you think you've got everything settled. I'd gotten so used to the routine here at Willow Creek, to the quiet and the sameness of each day, that I almost convinced myself this was enough, that nothing from before could reach me out here. But then, like some twist I never saw coming, Aiden showed up again. I wasn't ready for it, not even close. It was late afternoon, one of those days where the light slants just right, and the whole sky turns soft and golden, like honey. I'd been standing by the paddock, watching moonlight wander lazily across the field, letting my thoughts drift. It had become my habit, those moments by the fence, my little escape. I didn't hear him at first. I was lost in my head, thinking about nothing and everything all at once. But then I felt it. That shift in the air, the kind that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up before your brain catches up. I turned, and there he was. Aiden. Just standing there, like no time had passed at all, leaning casually against the fence like it was the most natural thing in the world? For a split second, I wondered if I was dreaming. He looked almost exactly the same as I remembered. Same easy posture. Same sharp eyes that always seemed to see too much. Maybe a little older, a little more worn around the edges, but still unmistakably him. My heart skipped, and I hated that it did. I hadn't thought about him in a long time. Or at least, that's what I'd been telling myself. Seeing him in the flesh brought everything I'd tucked away rushing back to the surface. All the old feelings, the questions, the parts of me I thought I'd buried. He didn't say anything right away, just nodded, his gaze steady on mine, like he was waiting to see how I'd react. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my face neutral, trying not to let on that the ground had just shifted under my feet. Aiden, I managed to say, keeping my voice even. Didn't expect to see you here. Understatement of the year, really. He gave me a half smile, one corner of his mouth lifting just slightly. Yeah, been a while, he said simply, like no explanation was needed. But there were about 100 questions swirling in my head. Where he'd been, why he was back now, what he was looking for. I didn't ask any of them. The air between us felt tight, like we were standing on the edge of something neither of us was ready to name. I glanced back toward the house, toward the barn, anywhere but at him, trying to get my bearings. What brings you to Willow Creek? I asked, my hands tightening around the fence rail. He shrugged, eyes never leaving mine. Just passing through, he said. Thought I'd check in. Simple words, but they carried weight. It was like he was saying so much more, without actually saying it, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to hear it. We stood there for a moment, both of us quiet. I could feel the wind picking up, brushing loose strands of hair across my face. Everything around us, the hills, the fading sunlight, even moonlight lazily grazing nearby, felt distant, like background noise to whatever unspoken thing was hovering between us. Finally, he glanced toward the barn, his gaze lingering for a beat. You still taking photos? He asked, his tone casual, but something deeper flickering underneath. My stomach clenched. I shook my head before I even thought about it. Not really, I said, my voice soft. Haven't for a while. His eyes flicked back to mine, something unreadable passing through them. Shame, he murmured, almost like he was talking to himself. That one word hit harder than I expected. It wasn't accusatory, wasn't judging, but it landed somewhere deep, in that part of me I'd been ignoring for too long. The part that used to light up at the idea of chasing sunsets, capturing life in all its messy, beautiful moments. Aiden didn't press. He never did. That was always one of the things about him. He had this way of seeing people without needing to pick them apart. But the way he looked at me, I knew he saw right through the polished surface I'd worked so hard to keep up. I wanted to tell him that life happened, that I had responsibilities now, that dreams don't always fit neatly into the boxes we build for ourselves. But I didn't, because something about the way he stood there made all those excuses feel thin and hollow. We fell into a strange kind of silence after that, but it wasn't awkward. It was thick, charged, like the air before a storm. Like there was a conversation waiting to happen, but neither of us knew how to start it. After a while, he pushed off the fence, hands in his pockets. "I'll be around," he said, his voice low, almost like a promise. "If you ever feel like talking." I nodded, not trusting myself to say much else. I watched as he walked away, his figure growing smaller against the backdrop of the hills until he disappeared. And even after he was gone, I stood there, heart pounding, feeling like I'd just been spun around. It wasn't just about Aiden being back. It was about everything his presence stirred up inside me. The restlessness, the ache, the sharp reminder of who I used to be before I started quieting that part of myself to fit into the life I chose. Seeing him again was like holding up a mirror I'd been avoiding, and the reflection staring back wasn't one I could ignore anymore. I didn't know what I was going to do with all of it yet. But one thing was clear. The past wasn't as far behind me as I thought. And maybe, just maybe, it was time I stopped pretending it was. I knew something had shifted the minute I heard Marcus's truck tires crunching over the gravel earlier than usual. It was one of those little things you notice without even realizing you're noticing it. The sound of his engine on the drive, the way it echoed differently in the quiet evening air. Normally, he stayed in the city longer, sometimes a few extra days if his work kept him. That's how it had been for months now. He'd leave, come back late, distracted, head already filled with whatever deal or project was taking up all his attention. I got used to it, almost welcomed the empty space it left behind. It gave me room to think, or maybe not think too much, to let the house stay silent without pretending. But tonight, when I heard that truck pulling in before dark, something inside me tensed. Like my body knew before my mind caught up that nothing about this night would be routine. I stood frozen by the barn door, still holding my camera. I had been standing out there all afternoon, trying to shake off the feeling left behind after seeing Aiden earlier. The conversation, if you could even call it that, kept replaying in my head, looping over and over like a song I couldn't get out of my ears. His words, his quiet way of looking at me like he could see right through the life I'd built, had left me rattled. And now, with Marcus's headlights cutting through the dark and sweeping over the fields, that unease coiled tighter. The barn felt too small, too exposed. I didn't move as he parked, engine humming low before shutting off with that heavy, final sound. For a second, I thought maybe I could slip back to the house before he made it to the barn, avoid whatever was about to happen. But part of me knew it was too late for that. I watched as he got out of the truck, his familiar outline illuminated by the last scraps of fading light. He moved slower than usual, shoulders squared but tense, his posture stiff in a way that made my stomach sink. He didn't call out to me like he sometimes did. No casual hello or tired smile. Just walked straight toward the barn, each step deliberate, almost too controlled. I swallowed hard and set the camera down on the ledge beside me, suddenly feeling like I was holding something far heavier than it was. The closer Marcus got, the clearer it became that he wasn't here to talk about work or small everyday things. Something in his face, in the set of his jaw, told me he already knew too much. He stopped just inside the barn entrance, the light behind him casting long shadows across the floor. For a few beats, neither of us said a word. The silence between us felt sharp, brittle, like the slightest wrong move could shatter whatever thin thread was holding us together. "Didn't expect you home so soon," I finally said, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. Marcus's eyes flicked over to the camera, then back to me. He didn't smile. "I wrapped up early," he replied, simple, even. But his tone was clipped, carrying something else underneath, something heavy. He shifted slightly, leaning his weight against one of the wooden beams, his gaze fixed on me like he was trying to figure out what to say next. I waited, pulse drumming hard in my ears. And then he spoke, voice low but sharp. "You've been spending a lot of time out here lately." It wasn't a question. More like an observation layered with accusation, though it came out measured, careful. I felt my throat tighten. My first instinct was to brush it off, pretend like nothing had changed, that it was just me keeping busy, like I always did when he was away. But something about the way he looked at me made that lie feel hollow. "Just clearing my head," I murmured, eyes darting down to my hands. Marcus didn't react right away. Instead, he kept watching me, as if waiting for me to offer up something else. When I didn't, he pushed off the beam, taking a step closer. "And Aiden?" he asked then, his voice calm but the tension threaded clear through every syllable. My heart skipped. I looked up sharply, caught off guard, though I shouldn't have been. Of course he knew. Marcus always paid attention to the things I thought he overlooked. I swallowed, forcing my face neutral. "What about him?" I asked, trying to sound casual, even though my voice shook just enough to betray me. He studied me for a long moment, his jaw tight, eyes narrowing slightly. "I've seen how you've been since he showed up," he said finally, voice quieter now, but no less pointed. "Different. Distant." His words felt like a spotlight suddenly shining straight at me, illuminating every thought I'd tried to keep hidden. I opened my mouth, searching for something to say, but nothing came. Because he wasn't wrong. I had been different, and not just because of Aiden, but because something inside me had been unraveling long before Aiden ever reappeared. Marcus let out a breath, not quite a sigh, but close. He looked tired, like he'd been carrying something heavy for a while and didn't know how to set it down. "Isla," he said, softer now, "I'm not blind. I know there's something going on. I just need to know. Is there something you're not telling me?" The weight of the question settled heavily between us. I could hear the wind rustling outside, the faint creak of the barn walls. For a heartbeat, I thought about lying, smoothing it over, pretending everything was fine like I'd done so many times before. But I couldn't. Not anymore. Not after how much had already shifted inside me. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the man who had built this life with me, who had offered me safety and steadiness when I'd been tired of running. But I also saw the gap between us, the miles of silence, the things left unsaid, the pieces of myself I'd slowly lost along the way. "I don't know how to explain it," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But something's not right. It hasn't been for a long time." Marcus's expression didn't change much, but his eyes flickered, like he'd known the answer all along, but had hoped I wouldn't say it out loud. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, like he was bracing for something. The silence stretched thin, the distance between us feeling wider than the ranch itself. "Okay," he said quietly, after what felt like forever. And then, without another word, he turned and walked back toward the house, leaving me standing there, heart pounding, unsure if I'd just broken something or if it had already been broken long before. I stayed there long after he was gone, staring out into the dark, feeling the weight of everything unsaid hanging in the air. The divide between us had been there for years, growing slowly, quietly. But now, for the first time, it felt impossible to ignore. It's funny how easy it is to forget who you used to be when you're busy living someone else's version of the life you're supposed to want. I didn't mean for it to happen. I didn't wake up one day and decide to leave all of it, my dreams, my work, my sense of self, sitting in a dusty box somewhere. It just happened. Slowly, quietly, piece by piece, until one day I looked around and couldn't quite remember when I'd stopped being that girl with the camera, the girl who used to see beauty everywhere, even in the mess. I've been thinking about her a lot lately, more than I'd like to admit. Especially now, with everything shifting around me. Marcus's questions hanging in the air, Aiden showing up like some ghost from the past, stirring up parts of me I thought I'd buried. It's like the universe has been forcing me to look backward, whether I want to or not. And when I do, what I see feels like watching someone else's life, one I'm not sure how to get back to. Back then, everything felt different, bigger, brighter. I used to walk through the city streets like they were alive, my camera always slung over my shoulder, ready to catch whatever moment came next. It didn't matter if it was something small, a kid laughing, light hitting an alley just right, or something chaotic and unpredictable. It was all worth capturing. I lived for those moments, the ones no one else noticed, but felt huge to me. I wanted to show people the things they missed when they were too busy rushing around, too distracted to really look. That's what photography meant to me. Not just pictures, but proof that the world was raw and wild and beautiful if you just slowed down long enough to see it. I was good at it too. People used to tell me I had an eye, that I could frame something ordinary and make it feel extraordinary. There were galleries, shows, little exhibitions where my work hung on white walls under bright lights. I remember the first time one of my photos sold. It was a shot of an empty field at dusk, the kind of image that felt simple on the surface, but heavy underneath, like it held secrets. The buyer told me it reminded them of freedom. At the time, I smiled, nodded, thanked them. But deep down, I knew what they meant. That's what it always felt like to me, too. Freedom. My work, my life, it felt like mine. No rules, no limits, no one telling me how to live. I had friends back then, people who understood that kind of restless energy, that need to keep moving, keep creating. We'd stay up late talking about art, about chasing light, about how nothing in the world felt as electric as holding a camera and knowing you were about to catch something no one else saw. I was happy in those moments. Not perfectly happy. Not every day was easy. But I felt alive. And then, somewhere along the way, Marcus came into the picture. It wasn't sudden, not at first. I met him at one of my shows, one of those sleek little galleries downtown. He wasn't like the others. He didn't talk about art or light or dreams. He talked about plans, about futures, about what came after the chaos settled. He was confident, solid in a way I wasn't. When he looked at me, he made me feel steady, grounded, like maybe I didn't have to keep running all the time. At first, I liked that feeling. I liked the idea of quiet for once. So when he painted the picture of a life out in the country, no more tiny apartments, no more worrying about paying rent, no more chasing after the next show or the next paycheck, it felt like a relief. Like maybe it was time to stop, to settle, to trade in the unpredictability for something calm and safe. I told myself I could have both, that I could keep my photography, keep my spark, and still step into the life he offered me. But the truth is, once we moved to Willow Creek Ranch, things shifted, little by little, without either of us noticing. I set the camera down one day, just for a while, thinking I'd pick it up again soon. But then there were horses to feed, a house to keep, dinners to make. Marcus's business started growing, and he needed me to be steady, to be the person who kept things running while he worked. The camera stayed on the shelf. Months turned into years. And somewhere in all of that, the girl who used to wake up excited to chase light disappeared. I told myself it was fine, that I was fine. I had what I needed: security, stability, a roof over my head, a partner who worked hard. I convinced myself that was enough. But lately, it feels like the past is creeping back in, no matter how tightly I tried to shut the door on it. Seeing Aiden again cracked something open, but honestly, it had been cracking long before he showed up. Even before that, there'd be moments when I'd walk past the barn and catch sight of that camera sitting there, dusty, forgotten, like a piece of me left behind. I'd feel this ache, sharp and sudden, like remembering something important, right when it's too late to do anything about it. But now it feels different, louder, harder to ignore. I can't help but wonder, when did I decide I had to choose between who I was and who I thought I needed to be? And was it really a choice? Or did I just let life sweep me along until I didn't recognize myself anymore? I think about the girl I used to be, the one who wasn't afraid to take risks, to fail, to get messy, the one who didn't measure her worth by how perfectly she kept things together. She's still in there somewhere. I can feel her, restless, waiting, wondering when I'll stop pretending that safety is enough to quiet everything I've buried. Maybe the camera isn't just some relic of my past after all. Maybe it's the one thing that's been trying to remind me of who I was all along. It was bound to happen eventually. You can only tiptoe around the truth for so long before it corners you, leaving you nowhere to run. That's exactly how it felt the night everything finally cracked wide open between Marcus and me. There'd been this slow buildup for weeks, maybe even months if I'm honest. Little things piling up, glances that lingered too long, conversations that felt like walking on eggshells, that heavy silence filling up every room. And then, of course, Aiden showing up didn't help. Not that I ever meant for it to be about him. It wasn't really. He was more like a mirror, reflecting everything I'd been trying to avoid seeing about myself and my life. But Marcus noticed. He always noticed. I could feel it hanging in the air between us, thick and tense, like a storm you can smell before it breaks. That night, Marcus came home later than usual. I heard the truck pull in while I was sitting at the kitchen table trying to focus on something, anything, to keep my mind from spiraling. I'd been staring at the same piece of paper for who knows how long, but the words never really sank in. I knew he'd been in the city again, probably buried in work, probably thinking through whatever was bothering him as he drove back. I listened as the engine cut off, listened to his footsteps crunching over the gravel, slow and deliberate. My chest felt tight, like I'd been holding my breath for hours and couldn't let it out. When he walked through the door, he didn't say much at first, just set his keys down, shrugged off his jacket, moved around the kitchen like it was any other night. But the way he moved, the way his shoulders stayed stiff, told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't going to be like every other night. I stayed quiet, my hands resting flat against the table, trying to stay calm, trying to prepare myself. Eventually, he poured himself a drink, sat down across from me, and that silence between us stretched and stretched until it felt unbearable. Finally, he broke it. "Isla," he said, voice low but steady. "We need to talk." My heart skipped. I looked up, meeting his eyes, and all I saw there was something tired, something heavy, like he'd been carrying this weight for too long and couldn't hold it anymore. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak yet. He let out a breath, ran a hand over his face, and leaned forward. "I've tried to give you space," he started, and his voice had this controlled calm to it, like he was holding himself together piece by piece. "Tried to pretend everything was fine, but it's not, is it?" I swallowed hard. My fingers tightened against the edge of the table because there was no use denying it. We both knew. Still, I stayed quiet, waiting. He shook his head slightly, eyes flicking to the side like he couldn't quite keep looking at me. "You've been somewhere else lately," he continued. "Not here. Not with me." His voice cracked a little at the end, but he pushed through. "And then Aiden shows up, and suddenly you're different." The way he said Aiden's name made my stomach twist, like it wasn't just a name but a wound he couldn't stop poking at. I felt my pulse pounding in my ears, felt every part of me tense up. "It's not about him," I said quickly, quietly, though even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure they sounded convincing. Marcus's gaze snapped back to me, sharp now, almost accusing. "Isn't it?" he asked, voice low but pointed. "Because from where I'm standing, it sure looks like he's got something to do with it." I shook my head, trying to find the right words, the ones that could explain everything I'd been feeling without making it sound like it was all about Aiden. Because it wasn't. Not really. He was just the spark, not the fire. "Marcus, it's not him," I said, softer now. "It's me. It's everything I've been holding in for so long." He leaned back slightly, crossing his arms like he was bracing for whatever was coming next. "Then tell me," he said, and his voice wasn't angry exactly, just strained. "Tell me what it is." The lump in my throat felt like it was going to choke me. I stared down at the table for a moment, forcing myself to breathe, and when I finally spoke, my voice came out raw, uneven. "I don't know who I am anymore," I admitted. "I've been living this life, going through the motions, trying to be what I thought I was supposed to be. But somewhere along the way, I lost myself." I lifted my eyes to his, and what I saw there almost broke me. Not just hurt, but confusion, sadness, maybe even fear. "And when Aiden showed up," I continued, "it just made me realize how far away I've gotten from the person I used to be." The words hung in the air like something heavy and unavoidable. Marcus didn't speak right away. His jaw clenched, and he looked down at his hands for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, rougher. "So, what does that mean?" he asked. "What do you want?" I opened my mouth, but no answer came. How could I tell him I didn't know yet? That all I knew was the ache inside me, the restless feeling that had been gnawing at me for years, that I couldn't keep living in this half version of myself, even if it hurt to admit it. The silence stretched between us again, thicker now, almost unbearable. He stood up then, slowly, like he needed to put space between us. He walked to the sink, stared out the window into the dark fields beyond. His shoulders stayed tense, like he was holding something back. Finally, without turning around, he spoke again. "I don't want to lose you," he said simply, quietly. And that broke something inside me, because I didn't want to hurt him. I never wanted that. But at the same time, I knew I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine just to keep the peace. Not anymore. I stood up too, my chest tight, unsure if I should reach for him or let him be. "I don't have all the answers yet," I whispered, "but I can't keep pretending I'm okay when I'm not." He nodded once, still not looking at me. And then, after a long moment, he said, "Maybe we both need some time to figure things out." His voice was steady, but I could feel the weight in it, the sadness creeping around the edges. I watched as he grabbed his jacket, the keys, moving like a man who needed to get away from the weight of the walls closing in. I didn't stop him. I couldn't. I stood there, the sound of the door closing behind him echoing through the empty kitchen, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might crack right open. Everything was out in the open now, raw and messy. There was no taking it back. No more pretending. And as much as it terrified me, a small part of me also felt something else. A quiet relief. Like maybe the truth was finally out, and maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward figuring out who I really was. The next morning felt eerily quiet, like the house itself was holding its breath. After the conversation Marcus and I had the night before, after all those words we'd both been avoiding finally spilled out, it was like the air had shifted. I woke up early, the way I always do, but everything felt different. The bed beside me was empty. I knew Marcus had left sometime during the night. I didn't hear him go, but I could feel it. The emptiness he left behind settled heavy in the room. The note he'd written sat folded neatly on the kitchen table, short and to the point. He said he'd be staying in the city for a while. Said he needed space to figure things out. I stared at that note for a long time, my coffee growing cold in front of me, wondering if I should feel sadder or angrier or more afraid. But what I felt most was stillness. Not the suffocating kind that had been weighing me down for years, but something lighter, like a door cracked open just enough to let in a breath of fresh air. I didn't know what to do with it at first. I wandered the house, ran my hands over familiar things, the framed photos, the books on the shelves, the little knickknacks we'd collected over the years. Everything looked the same, but it all felt different, almost like I was looking at someone else's life, someone I'd been trying to fit into but never quite belonged to. Eventually, my feet led me out to the barn. It wasn't something I thought about. I just found myself standing there, staring at the shelves, my eyes landing on the camera I'd left sitting there months, no, years ago. Dust coated it, the leather strap worn and stiff. I reached for it slowly, like it might crumble in my hands. But when I picked it up, it felt solid, familiar, like muscle memory, like an old friend I hadn't seen in too long. I turned it over, running my fingers across the buttons, the scratches, the places where the paint had chipped away. It felt heavier than I remembered, but somehow right. I walked outside with it, not thinking about where I was going, letting my feet carry me. The sun was just starting to rise, the light soft and golden, stretching over the fields like a warm blanket. I stood there by the fence, the camera hanging loosely from my fingers, and breathed in the cool morning air. Moonlight was grazing nearby, his white coat catching the sunlight, and I watched the way the light danced over him, the way the shadows stretched across the ground. Without thinking, I lifted the camera to my face, peered through the viewfinder, and framed the scene. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt that familiar spark flicker in my chest, the quiet thrill of seeing something through the lens, of freezing a moment in time. I pressed the shutter, and the sound of it clicked through the air, soft but sure. That small sound felt like something breaking loose inside me. It wasn't just about taking a photo. It was about remembering that I used to be someone who saw beauty everywhere, someone who didn't need permission to chase after it. I stood there for a while, clicking a few more shots, not worrying about whether they were perfect, not thinking about anyone else. Just me, the camera, the quiet world around me. And with each photo, something inside me loosened. A little more of the tension, the guilt, the fear I'd been carrying around for so long. I didn't have all the answers, Marcus was gone. Aiden was still out there somewhere, a question mark I wasn't ready to face yet. My future felt wide open and uncertain, filled with decisions I didn't know how to make. But for that one moment, none of it felt as heavy. I walked back to the barn, carefully setting the camera down on the ledge, wiping some of the dust away, and I realized something simple, something I'd been too scared to admit before. Whatever comes next, it has to be my choice. Not what Marcus wants, not what anyone expects. Mine. I thought back to all the years I spent trying to be what I thought I should be, trying to fit neatly into the life that looked good on paper, but left me feeling empty inside. And maybe that's why this small step, picking up that camera again, felt so big. Because it wasn't about anyone else. It was about me finally listening to that quiet voice inside me, the one I'd silenced for far too long. Later that evening, I sat on the porch, the sun sinking low, painting the hills in soft purples and oranges. I felt calm in a way I hadn't in years, the kind of calm that comes when you stop running from yourself. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, and that used to terrify me. But now, sitting there, with the cool air brushing against my skin, the camera resting beside me, it felt more like freedom than fear. Maybe it was just one step, one small action. But sometimes, that's all it takes to start finding your way back to yourself. I smiled to myself, quietly, knowing that whatever path I chose next, at least now, I was finally the one choosing.